So speaking of user testing, I'm going to now hand over to Jack Craig. Jack is one of 3 user researchers that worked with us on the project. The other 2 are Harry Chanderpal and Jennifer Klepper, both from the National Archives. So Jack is a user researcher and he's a digital design lead at the V&A Museum. He has over 10 years of experience working in digital for organizations in the public and private sector, including UK Parliament, Wellcome Trust, and the London Evening Standard. He has a focus on designing user-centered and inclusive digital experiences. So I'll hand over to you now, Jack.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks for Colin for driving my slides. I had a last-minute panic, an issue in that I can't actually share my screen, but Colin's going to do the duties for me, so thanks, Colin. So yes, as Laura mentioned, I worked in the user experience research team for Deep Discoveries. I'm going to talk about some of the research we've done for this project, how we use that to define the prototype that Bernard just showed you, and how we tested that prototype with users and some of the insights we gained from that testing. Next slide, please. So the UX team consisted of myself, Bernard from the National Archives, who engineered the prototype as well, and also Jennifer and Harry from the National Archives. And then on the design side, and for the second phase of the project, we worked with Joe Briggs, who you heard earlier, and the team at Northumbria University to help inform the design of the prototype. Next slide. Our research was split across 2 parts. So in part 1, we conducted a limited review of papers, blog posts, and articles centered around the research questions from the project proposal. We looked at some of the existing digital image collections, both with and without visual search features as well. Harry and our team also carried out 5 semi-structured interviews with people from various fields in design. The purpose of these interviews was to gather insights from current and potential audiences of online graphic collections and visual search. And he also asked how they went about finding inspiration generally, what they were looking for, what tools they used. And also, as part of those interviews, she showed the participants wireframes of visual search to help stimulate a conversation and responses around the potential of visual search, which can be a bit abstract in an interview. We also put together a short 5-minute survey, which was developed to understand how people look for visual inspiration in the cultural heritage sector, and to gauge current use of tools such as visual search. The survey had an uptake of over 200 responses, and I'll talk through those in a minute. And we also held a workshop with visual collection experts from our project partners and several other institutions. The goal of the workshop was to use the expertise from participants to find out who used their digital collections, how they were used and why. And additionally, we want to look at some of the obstacles of online graphic collections and how visual search might be used to overcome them. And then for the second part, we used the insights gained from our research to inform the design of the prototype shown by Bernard. We then used the prototype to test that with users. And as Joe mentioned earlier, we did one unmoderated testing with a static prototype. So unmoderated testing is like an automated script-driven online test that allows us to test with a larger number of people. However, the functionality of the prototype is more limited. It's more of like an on-rails prototype. But also because Bernard built a live HTML concrete prototype, we also conducted moderated testing, and that was facilitated by myself and Jennifer remotely over Microsoft Teams and Zoom. And this was used with 5 individual participants, and this allowed us to really observe the users and dig into how they use the prototype in depth. Next slide. So I'll start off with a quick summary of some of the findings. As I said before, some of the findings from the survey, there were over 200 participants. They were generally recruited from people already engaged with the sector, so we need to bear that in mind when we analyse the results a little bit. Next slide. So of us, and again, this is actually a very quick snapshot. There's a lot of our questions, so I'm just trying to fit in as much as I can in the 15 minutes we've got. Of our survey participants, the majority use a combination of Google and specialist apps like Pinterest and Instagram to look for imagery online. Next slide. 54% of participants had said they used visual search previously, and of those, 81% they had used it sometimes to rarely. So for the most part, it's not currently a regular go-to-use tool. Next slide. When we asked about their overall experience of visual search, just over a quarter said they often or always found what they were looking for. And the majority, nearly half, said they sometimes found what they're looking for. Just under a quarter struggled to find what they wanted, generally when they used visual search tools. I think what the last two slides maybe reflect is that visual search is still quite a new novel concept to end users, and the standards and interfaces and functionality are really still developing. We asked people why they had used visual search in the past, and it was a multiple choice question. Targeted searches, so for examples to find identical matches or to find out who created an image, were the most common answers. However, more broader open searches, such as to find similar images to a source image, were also a frequent use case. So that was a whirlwind snapshot of some of our survey findings. I'll now go over an overview of some of the key themes we discovered around barriers to access to digital graphic collections from the desk research, interviews and workshop. So the scale of large collections can be overwhelming, and browsers without fixed intent can struggle to know where to start. Also, many collections are only partially available online, which may be due to issues with rights or funding. So users may falsely assume that that is everything that is available in that collection. Also, availability and quality of metadata, again, due often to limited resources, metadata can be incomplete. And the languages and terminologies used that main metadata may not match that of the users. So users may lack, or they have different terminologies to how the collections have been catalogued themselves. On interfaces, they can be limited. They might cater better to one set of users, for example, researchers, but less well to more specialist users. So often interfaces can also reflect the institutional, internal, structural, and can reflect the internal structures and processes rather than aligning to the user's mental models and their needs. And then finally, awareness of online collections. Users need to know that they exist before they can start using it. And even for professional or academic researchers, there can be low expectations for knowing that institutions actually have this available online. So we took our findings from the research to produce 3 user-centered problem statements that visual search may help to overcome. These will then be used to help inform the design of the prototype. So briefly, the first problem statement we devised was, as a designer, when I'm looking for source material for inspiration, I often struggle to frame a useful keyword query to search the graphic collection database. The scale of the collection can be overwhelming. I don't know where to start. I know what I like when I see it. So we see this as quite an open type of search, as the user, as the interface might suggest source imagery to the user, and then that can be their starting point for exploring that collection. A second problem statement we looked at was, as a designer, when I'm looking for an image or design for an organization that I would like to reuse, I struggle to find information about whether there are IP rights associated and who owns those rights so we can request permission. This is more of a typical of a targeted, or even it could be a category-based search. So for a targeted search, you might have an image that you want to use visual search to find out who owns that image, find out the rights. And if you find out that it's not available to use, visual search could then help you in a more category-based style of search, where you go, okay, well, I can't use that one, but are there similar images that I could use that I do have the rights to use? And then our third and final problem statement was, as a student, I sometimes struggle to find imagery for my research. Often I can't find any imagery of the subject at all. When there is, it might be low quality or limited to just one view. Ideally, I like to see something from different angles or views in different contexts. And this is much more of a targeted search. So they might have a particular object or image in mind, and they want to see maybe see that image in different contexts or from different angles. And that's another potential use case that visual search could help with. So finally, I'll talk through some of the insights we gained from the moderated and unmoderated testing with users. Participants were generally practitioners in art and design. or people working in the cultural heritage sector. So although they represent a clear target audience for visual search tools, it doesn't represent users who aren't already engaged. Also, just to say, in terms of prior experience of visual search tools, we had a mix of users who had used visual search before and some who hadn't. So the tasks, we set them, we had a basic image searching task. So a few of the, we would set them up with a defined image, and then we had another task where they had a free selection of images. Next slide. And this one's got a video, if you could press play. So searching via multiple images to help make the query more relevant. And then Bernard has showed you this previously, and this is another example of it in the video. And then the next slide, please. Oh, the video's going. Yes, and then this one is, again, this is the concept of refining via selected aspects of multiple images. So this example shows us selecting an aspect of just one image, but we also tested doing this over multiple images, as Bernard showed previously as well. And then finally, we tested the image likeness functionality. And again, this was to help users understand their results through heat maps, which then helps to explain the similarity with your source image. So some of the feedback we got from users. So overall, there's enthusiasm for visual search and the potential of the prototype. On the basic level of searching via single image, users picked it up quickly and saw the usefulness of the tool. We found the prototype was generally more successful with more targeted search rather than open searches. And as it's a prototype, and this is the first time we've tested it with users, there's a number of usability issues. And again, these are quite novel, as you have said before, these are quite novel concepts, and there aren't standardized patterns that are familiar to users yet. So when looking at the feedback, we had to try and detangle issues with the interface versus the concepts that maybe were just inherently problematic. We don't want to blame actually something that might be quite an interesting concept with the fact that there might just be usability issues with the interface. In order to get more clear-cut insight, we really need to iterate the prototype and test with users over multiple rounds. So for sorry, same slide, haven't moved one yet. One before? Yes, that's one. So for the first quote here, a lot of, I'll read out some of these quotes. For the first quote, a lot of users that I work with don't particularly care about the date range or the format. If I could just say to them, could you provide me with a couple of images of what you're interested in? I know I'll find some matches. I could do that quite easily rather than think about describing that image. So this speaks to a lot of the positive feedback for how it could be used to overcome barriers due to terminology. The other thing that was noted in the feedback on the unmoderated testing is that the potential that tools like this can have for people who might struggle with the written language, whether it's not their first language or maybe they have dyslexia or something like that. And then a couple of, the last quotes were also quite nice. It feels like a really useful thing, and it allows you to sort of create similarity without having to articulate what that is verbally. So I think it makes a lot of sense, which is good to hear. Next slide. Over multiple images. In terms of searching via multiple images, most users didn't expect it. And there were some improvements we could make to the interface to help with that. But at first, some participants thought it was comparing your original image with the selected results. However, when users clicked the update your results button, they generally got it and they could see the usefulness in it. Again, this is a novel concept to users. So this first quote is someone trying to explain what they think is happening, and it's obviously quite difficult. So the quote is some sort of a logarithm that's trying to combine some assessment of all the images that I've selected and find other images that somehow fit on the matrix across all those images. So it's a difficult thing for people to articulate, but you can see that they're kind of getting the gist of what's happening. But people did also have questions about how it worked. So that second quote, it makes me curious to see what happens if you add a number of disparate images. Would it find commonality, or would it instead find common images to each one individually? And also, just to say, this prototype allowed users to select images that add weight to their query. One user wanted to do the opposite and say, actually, I don't want images like this result, which I thought was interesting. The likeness view. So The heat map generally confused and distracted people. Some didn't understand which colours represented similarity. So that first quote, are blues are most alike, and it's actually the opposite, it's the red. And this also speaks to broader accessibility issues with using coloured heat maps to convey meaning. This would be, obviously problematic for people with colour blindness. And then users also found it quite ambiguous what it was matching on. Was it the object or the colours or the styles? The second quote, it's saying that this part is most alike when obviously it should be the centre, but maybe that's because it's based on colour. So again, there's a mismatch with people's mental models. And generally having a heat map over your results was seen as distracting. I'm not convinced by lightness view, too scientific and technical for what I would use it for. It's just distracting. I would prefer to analyse it myself, which I thought was interesting, like they'd actually prefer to make that judgment themselves. We're trying to help explain why this is happening, but this person's saying, I just want to make that judgment myself. However, again, we need to make sure that we detangle the concept that's of the idea of using visualization to explain the results with problems in the interface. So there could actually be other ways of visualizing this that might help overcome some of the barriers we have here. This fourth quote is a bit more of a positive response to it. I can sort of see why I can sort of see why it's doing things, even if I don't understand. I like the sort of a gesture towards explainability here. So I think there's potential in this. The next one, refining by image aspect. So again, users struggled a bit with the flow and interface for the refining images via aspects, which can be tightened up if we iterated the prototype. Selecting areas of interest was seen as exciting, but results were often seen as underwhelming, and this may be due to our limited data set. So in that first quote, it's trying to refine the selection based on the changes I made. The selection gives more weight, so they get what's happening. But we also think that more clear feedback was needed when refining the search in this way, and there's other ways of selecting parts of the image other than drawing that might be more intuitive to users. And I think Joe earlier on showed some potential for that in some of their early iterations of their designs. Users again felt it was a bit ambiguous what it was refining on. So was it the color or the object? Again, that speaks to the second quote. I wanted this color rather than the green, was one of the responses. It's seen as more useful. It was seen generally as more useful for refining by semantic similarity, but less successful for more ambiguous searching via things like style, which can have different meanings depending on the user and the context. This last person had a good quote. Could be useful for details of buildings, not so useful for textiles with repeating patterns. So next slide, please. The lack of metadata was seen as a big issue, and users just wanted more context. The second quote here, linking is crucial. I couldn't use it without that. Without background information, it wouldn't be helpful. However, one user who works in the sector did see the potential for accessing collections with limited metadata. So with some additional context, I would use it for work, particularly in our collection when there is low contextual detail. And then behind the scenes, no one had a strong sense of how the similarities were being found. Users were often unsure why these images were brought forward. They tried to unpick what they thought the similarities were, but they often weren't sure. So the first quote, I really don't know what's happening behind the scenes. Maybe things are being tagged with something. And then there was a mixed feeling of how important it was to know what's happening behind the scenes. And this probably depends on the role. If someone's using this for research, they probably want to know why these connections are being suggested to them. And so you can see that in these two contrasting quotes at the bottom. The first one, I like to know who or what is involved in matching these. And then the second person, I'm curious, but I don't think it's important for the general public. If it worked well, it wouldn't change how I use it. It was really interesting to hear people's thoughts, processes as they went through each task. So for this first quote, I'm trying to decide which parts are important for me to find similarity in. Maybe similar colors or similar types of flowers, which might be more important to me. However, generally, due to the ambiguity in visual search, they wanted more control than what we gave them in the prototype. and they want a refinement via aspects. And the refinement that we did give them via aspects and multiple images was often not seen as enough or wasn't intuitive enough. So that last quote, I only really want to see photographs which might be interesting or show me the fabric prints. So I only want to see photographs or fabric prints. I'm trying to drill down on a specific material or object. And then lastly, one on trust. This didn't come out a lot, but we did get some interesting feedback on how users trusted institutions like the National Archives and the V&A. And this also referred back to some of the desk research that we did at the beginning and how that was important to their work. So this quote I thought was quite interesting. It's a little bit safer because it's not Google. I think working within a commercial company, I'm quite aware that maybe you don't actually want your trends to be set by a company like Google. So that was a very quick run through of some of our UX work. I wasn't able to cover everything, but hopefully you'll find something of interest in it. Thanks for listening.